Venezuela is in the crosshairs of the United States. Donald Trump has decided to essentially illegally attack that nation and take its president away. Basically, kidnapping and piracy and looting is being legalized. It's a really dangerous precedent. Not that the Americans haven't done this before, and I haven't been doing this, but to do it in such a flagrant, direct way is a question that needs to be now answered. And with me on the Deep Dive Perspective today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Ranjit Brar, who is the Secretary General of the Communist Party of Great Britain. And we're going to go into the Venezuela issue because there are all sorts of questions that remain unanswered. And usually it takes time for the dust to settle on such a major intervention before we really get to the truth. And we're going to ask some awkward questions about what the truth really is about this whole affair. Ranjit, welcome to the show. This was a shocking act, even by Donald Trump's standards, in terms of literally kidnapping a Venezuelan president. But there's all sorts of questions that are arising also around the nature of this operation and how it was so successful so quickly. There are also question marks about what the motives of the US really are. You have a fantastic overview about US imperialism in general. It'd be really good to get an overview of what you've been making out of the news that's been seeping out gradually.
Thanks for having me, Mohsin. It's lovely to be with you at a very difficult and sad time. We're living in a world which is dominated by imperialism, by monopoly capitalism, and by the very wealthy monopoly capitalist powers, particularly United States imperialism, which really is an empire in the classical sense. The way it operates, its financial interests, and the way its armies act really as the bailiff for those interests, So generally, its way of disciplining the world is through economics. There's such a concentration of wealth in the heartland of the United States, as represented by the Wall Street and the Wall Street capitalists, enormous oil companies, enormous tech companies. We're seeing the AI bubble on the back of those tech companies, but enormous tech companies, media companies, enormous weapons companies. But really, enormous financial power and industrial power that's controlled by that finance. And this is just precisely the features of monopoly capitalism described by Lenin in his classic epoch-breaking work on imperialism. And the first country really that applied to was Britain, who had the Industrial Revolution first, who then became a trading empire, who then had a physical empire that expanded to, the sun never set on the British Empire. And then export of capital becomes its major feature. So it becomes a financial empire. This whole question of deindustrialization of the United States, of Britain, that fewer and fewer people are involved in production, but that there's more and more wealth here, but that wealth is drawn from the production that happens all over the world. So this the entire working class becomes more and more organized under bigger and bigger business interests that control more and more of the world's economy. But it's therefore crucial for them to control raw materials, for them to control other nations. And certainly the post-Soviet space, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has been defined by that. We had the war on terror, and yet, the high General Wesley Clark was someone who was very famously, there was an interview, he sat down, I've just been to the White House, and they told me, it's not just Afghanistan, they're going to attack these nations. And he named the major colonial conflicts that were going to happen. So there's a list. And
Venezuela was amongst them.
Venezuela was amongst them. And they were, if you like, the key strategic areas of the globe that aren't yet fully under our control.
Sudan, Iran, Syria, I think Libya.
Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Venezuela. What's Venezuela doing? It seems so different. But of course, Venezuela, coming back to your question, Venezuela is sitting on a mountain, a lake of oil. So it has over 350 billion barrels of proven reserves. So it has got more oil, interestingly, than Saudi Arabia.
The largest in the world, there some people are
under
saying,
the Orinoco Delta, under Orinoco Basin, and which is why its neighboring countries, Guyana and Suriname, also have oil and also subject to the same kind of financial domination by particularly US enterprises. Traditionally, it's oil and its oligarchy were very closely allied to US imperialism. The Monroe Doctrine, this comes from the 1880s, and the time when the United States kicked the Spanish Empire out of the whole of the Americas. They said this will be our hemisphere, our zone of exclusive interest. That was supplemented by the Truman Doctrine after World War II, when they just dropped the atom bomb, when they said now the whole world is our sphere of interest. These are very specific doctrines which have dominated, Republican or Democrat, the workings of the whole of US imperialism. And Britain, it's a declining power, but it's fit in very well. They form a colony that has liberated itself, the United States, but their financial interests dovetail and their attitude towards the world dovetail. And Britain has a 400-year-old ruling class, which is very involved in these operations to control the world and still has huge financial interests.
So why now? Why did they move in this way? First of all, of course, they used the excuse of drugs, and the drugs issue keeps coming up as their go-to excuse for why this has happened. Trump talks about Maduro being a drug mafia lord, essentially. It sounds a little laughable to me, but that's why the American Navy, the largest gathering of the American Navy, was parked outside the shores of Venezuela. So why were they so heavy? Because I think the biggest source of drugs into America isn't necessarily from Venezuela. That's probably provable, although Trump and his administration are trying to say it is. Is it about drugs?
No. That was easy. Very easy. Not about drugs. I mean, lots of drugs do come from South America. When US, interestingly, occupied Afghanistan, the majority of the world's drug flow didn't come from Afghanistan at the beginning, but during their occupation, they promoted poppy cultivation, and Afghanistan became the center of the heroin industry. Yeah. US imperialism has left, and it's been suppressed.
Yeah, the statistics show that, yes.
So United States is the biggest drug lord nation. The majority of the proceeds of the 400 billion of drugs money annually goes through the Wall Street and the City of London. London is an enormous drugs capital of the world, and Washington is an enormous capital of the world. They're the biggest markets of the rich world, US and Europe. So it's all centered around there. Capitalism would collapse without the money. They include it in their figures of GDP. It's a sanctified industry, and at a very high level, drug lords have been protected. If you look at the entire history of Nicaragua, for example, the Contra guerrillas that the US funded were funded precisely as huge drug lords, which then took that drug laws and caused the crack epidemic in California. They protected Rick Ross, this enormous drug dealer in California. The proceeds that they got also were involved in the Contra affair, so in their other illegal CIA campaigns around the world. So the CIA has been long involved in the drug trade and gets part of its clandestine off-books funding from the drugs trade. That's the reality. Trump made a ridiculous, laughable assertion that 97% of the drug imports to the United States have been stopped now that they've kidnapped the president of Venezuela. Actually, Venezuela is interesting because while it traditionally was an oligarchy that was controlled by the United States and aligned with their interests, with the Monroe Doctrine, it has a long history of the Bolivarian Revolution. Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999. Hugo Chavez was a campesino. He was a peasant, but a very strong physical man, intellectually strong man, who raised up through the army to see the racket and want a degree of independence and a better life. Why do the people not benefit from the enormous oil wealth and other wealth of Venezuela? Why are we just an oil well with a flag serving United States interests? Why are the refineries in Texas, not in Venezuela? Why is industry not here? Why is the wealth not here? The same question that's asked in every country, regardless of culture, historical origin, race. This is not the question. The question is, why is it that US imperialism and their interests dominate ours? Why is the wealth sucked out of our country? And that's so he rose up, he had a revolution. Actually, initially, he tried an army coup, which was crushed. But because he was so popular, his death sentence was commuted. And ultimately, he came out, he was a tremendously popular figure, and he won a democratic election within the Venezuelan process, became the president. And if he was elected in 1999, in 2004, he had a massive program of nationalizing the oil wealth. Can you imagine? It's why they hate Iran. Nothing to do with their religion. Quite happy with the Saudis, equally or more religious. Yeah. It's not about religion. It's about who controls the wealth. So they took that enormous wealth away from the corporations. Trump is saying, we want our wealth back. We want our land back. We want all of our other resources. It's like a comic book, Well, interestingly, there was virtually no drugs production in Venezuela because they don't allow it. The Venezuelan government now is a socialist government, which has taken the national wealth and used it for the benefit of the people. US response to that was massive economic sanctions. They put it on their list of terrorist nations, together with Syria, together with Cuba, together with North Korea. So countries who take the wealth away from the United States corporations are designated terrorists. So this whole spiel, which was just a new thing, only come in the last couple of years, they've said, we'll put a $50 million, or within the last year actually, we'll put a $50 million reward on President Maduro's head. We'll nominate you as a narco-terrorist. There's no basis for it. It's a total fabrication and fiction. This is illegal war for domination and spoliation and plunder, not only of their oil, but also gold, lithium, other rare earth minerals, which are also a very hot topic for imperialism.
You rightly pointed out that South America generally has been the victim of many, many interventions by America. The CIA, etc., has been involved in Brazil, it's been involved in Chile, it's in virtually every South American country has been in one way or another tampered with. And that was the modus operandi of the Americans generally, even up to 10 years ago, perhaps. So they would do these indirect coups, they would undermine through sort of soft power, they would prop up their own opposition, controlled opposition, and make life difficult for anybody who was trying to actually do something for their people and push for sovereignty and for control of their own resources and a fairer distribution of the wealth. That's been a standard practice. We've all known that, though America still managed to sell to their own people the idea that they are freedom, liberty, democracy, and equality force around the world. And that's why they go around being a policeman. Isn't that all laid bare now? Because Donald Trump seems to have dropped that. This wasn't the CIA operating clandestinely. This was the president's office openly demanding a direct violation of international law and of the violation of the sovereignty of a nation. And it puts everybody on notice, doesn't it? I mean, every other South American ruler that isn't necessarily complying with the Americans or the Iranians or anybody else who's got a sovereign nation, isn't it putting them on notice that actually America will now directly intervene? Is that what they're trying to put across?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's not a secret, is it? but that's in essence why Trump's such an interesting character. He's that arch reactionary who stands for American imperialism like a Texan cowboy, thinks and speaks like it's a comic book cartoon, but he laid bare the true nature. He actually speaks the truth. When it was talking about Syria a few years ago, he was like, well, I don't think I'm stupid. People say you're stupid, your policy in Syria. So I don't think I'm stupid. We've got the oil. I don't think we're stupid. We've got the oil. We've got the oil. So it makes it very clear what it's all about. It's about demanding and dominating resources, plunder, robbery, nothing else. But where they failed and why they've done it now in Venezuela is a couple of things. One, they're going to war, you will have noticed, against Russia and against China.
I was going to raise
being their major economic and military rivals that's stopping them dominate the world. But in order to do that, they want to smash BRICS. They want to smash the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They want to make it impossible for any other country to drift towards that pole and have an alternative avenue of economics and military protection, apart from you accept the normal, playbook of US imperialism. You accept our institutions, you accept our loans, you accept our debt penury, you accept our wage slavery, you accept the domination of finance capital of the US and European corporations, but dominantly US corporations. Venezuela, they'd failed. They'd failed with the economic hitman, despite the strangulation of sanctions. Venezuela, a very wealthy country, but it used to be built upon export of oil, selling oil abroad. And when Chavez came, made a massive thing. All this oil revenue at a time of high oil prices, they made a ALBA, Alternativa Latin America Bolivarian, Bolivarian alternative for the Americas. I don't speak Spanish well, ALBA. And they made a kind of financial institution banking system. To call that money, they were giving out loans for development to Caribbean and their neighboring countries. No political strings attached, but starting to form the basis for an economic cooperation based upon their own oil wealth. It's anathema to the United States that nations would stand together and build an alternative economic model. It starts to become a federation of independent American nations that's not aligned to the interests of US imperialism plundering them. They started to use their wealth to fund social programs, universal education. There was a very low level of literacy. Now there's complete literacy. Very low level of schooling. Now everyone's in school. They were not self-sufficient in food. There's an enormous country with enormous land. The lands were owned by these big fincas, these kind of like big estates owned by a few wealthy landowners. They don't even raise crops on them. A lot of drug raising then, as there's in Colombia next door, which is the main hub of where cocaine comes from actually in Latin America. But they weren't divorced from food production over the last period. They become totally self-sufficient in food in response to the sanctions, in response to the needs. So starting to develop an all-rounded domestic economy that has technology, that has the ability, for example, as Bolivia started to do under Morales, take the lithium and not just send it for processing, but develop your own battery technology. Why don't we make batteries? Why don't we make cars? Why must we send all of our raw materials to the metropolis or to factories owned by the metropolis locally so that all production and wealth generation comes under the orbit and remit of the imperialists? So it's bucking that trend, taking wealth and wealth production, putting it in the hands of the people. This is the crime of the Bolivarian alternative and when Chavez died. And there are still questions about how Chavez died, just as there were so many death threats and assassination attempts against Castro. There were many against Chavez. And there are still many of his supporters who are convinced that he didn't just get cancer out of nowhere, that he was subject to probably some radioisotope that induced a radiation sickness in him because he became very sick very quickly, very aggressive cancer. He developed a very strong man before that. But afterwards, he took, who was President Nicolas Maduro? President Nicolas Maduro is someone who was a bus driver, who was a worker, who was a union man, who was a lifelong socialist, an activist in the PSUV, who came up and Chavez insisted that he should become, that he didn't want to become, insisted because he was incorruptible and strong and working class and fearless and linked with the mass of the people. And that's been their strength, to actually start to change the lives of the people and empower the people. And it's also why simply abducting the president will probably achieve nothing, actually.
Well, let's look at the abduction, because I don't want to go into conspiracy theory in its very early days, but there are a couple of implications that may be going under the radar. Firstly, the defense mechanisms of the Venezuelan military have to be questioned because they have Russian S-300s and I think manpads and systems for defense around Caracas. You'd have thought that there would have been some triggering of that. It doesn't seem like there was a huge response to this invasion, this kind of abduction operation. That's a question mark which some people are raising. There's also this idea that, again, and I'll leave this as a separate question, but I'll mention it now, maybe raise it a little later. But the Russian and Chinese interests, in a way, to defend the multipolar world, the alternatives, should surely partly include defending the likes of Venezuela and acting as a deterrent to US imperialism. But the thing I'm going to link is it that what the Americans and the Israelis have done in Gaza, in terms of wiping out an entire city, has become a marker and a threat for Russia and for China, as well as the likes of Venezuela and Iran, that look, we are willing to go to these lengths, that if you oppose our rapacious plunder of your nations and you impose your sovereignty and exclude us, that this is what we'll do. And by addition, is it that the likes of President Maduro and the Venezuelan military and the Venezuelan establishment think, rather than go down that route and get wiped out, we should perhaps just compromise? And some people are even going as far as to say this is very suspicious, the way the Americans were so easily able to abduct the president of a country, that it's almost like, is there an understanding going on under the surface? It's conspiracy theory territory, I know, but still the question has to be asked, how did it happen so easily?
There's a lot to unpack there. It's not really one question, but we can discuss that a bit. There's a few things. So imperialism is very powerful militarily, and US military budget exceeds the budget of all other nations on earth combined, pretty much, or certainly the next 10 major nations. That doesn't translate into direct power, but they have a huge footprint, and particularly in the Americas, They have a huge military footprint. So the concept that another friendly power, whether it's the Fatah or Hamas, or whether it's the Belgian Navy, even if they had an interest, or whether it's Russia, or whether it's Iran. Why didn't Iran come to the rescue, or China? The concept that they have the capability to military project and stop that kind of operation, you have to subject a bit of scrutiny and say, is that really the kind of power they have? Have they developed that power? What is it that makes them? So we're used to Britain, France in particular, formerly Germany, Japan, United States, developing weapon of projection, force projection. They're designed that way. Now you can argue actually they're becoming obsolete. They're becoming obsolete because in the era of hypersonic missiles, if they really go to war in a serious way, direct confrontational shooting war with Russia or China, pretty much all their battleships and all their means of force projection and their country is in range now. That's a new phenomenon. So they're kind of fighting shy of that. But it doesn't mean that, what would Russia to do? Was Russia going to shoot a hypersonic missile into the White House? Well, that's global thermonuclear war, isn't it? So what are the options? They're not set up. Ultimately, they can't do the fighting for them. People said the same thing when Syria fell. Oh, it's Russia's fault. Oh, it's China's fault. Or when Gaza happened, it's Russia's fault. It's China's fault. Well, how is it their fault? You have to look at the people who are committing the crimes, not the people who didn't stop the commission of the crime. By that definition, it's my fault every time a murder happens in the world. I didn't stop it. Did you stop it?
No.
It's your fault. Well, so exactly. So you have to take that with a pinch of salt. But that's also part of the psychological propaganda that our ruling class use against us. We're against it, but we're all plotting, oh, there must be, or it's people within. It's Russia and China. So it's very easy to get sidelined into that because that's part of their general mission as well, is to make us think ultimately US is the good guy, Britain is the good guy. Basically, there's peace, democracy, and liberty in our own countries, and the rest of the world, well, they're tin pot African and South American dictatorships. They're not like us. That's that part of that whole narrative. Well, that's not right. So I don't blame Russia or China. In terms of, was it so easy? Well, sure, it was so easy. They've been trying for 26 years to displace this Bolivarian movement. And the response of that is to say that, an individual can die, but a revolution or an idea can't be killed.
Well, the people of Venezuela are, they're robustly coming out on the streets, it seems, against what's happened and demanding Maduro is returned. And they don't seem to be flaking away necessarily.
I don't think they are. And there's some talk of, about what's happening. There was a concept that Machado, who is this, very wealthy scion of the comprador class in Venezuela, so very, very wealthy family, who's been given the Nobel Peace Prize, though she's a Zionist and she's a totally antisocial element of the rich, aligned with US imperialism. So they've given her a Nobel Peace Prize, and we thought they would try and install her. How are they going to install her? They can't do it. And I think that Trump has basically admitted that. So there's some kind of implication. They're working with the vice president. If you look at the history of the vice president, I don't know particularly well.
Her father was killed, I think.
Her father was killed by the CIA and was a lifelong socialist campaigner. And she's become the vice president in a very strong socialist government, which is connected to the masses. You can't underestimate the extent to which they have connected their movement to the masses. They have a movement of communes, and they recently adopted a communal constitution in which essentially they want to make the unit of basic power local self-government of the workers in their locality and in their workplaces. Now, that's a massive move. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's to nip that process in the bud of really transferring power away from a bourgeois constitutional model towards a model where the mass of workers themselves have direct power. They had to do that in an extent to survive the economic sanctions, but they're formalizing it. They are in process as they're housing everyone and clothing everyone and feeding everyone and educating everyone and educating them. The masses have taken a revolutionary, if you like, nationalism. They are proud of what they've achieved. They want to defend their sovereignty. And that goes along with the army. The army, and one of the secrets of Venezuela's revolutionary process remaining in power, has been the sympathy of the army. Very deliberate, political alignment between the army, the mass of the army, and its leadership, and the government, and the people. And there are now 4.5 million Venezuelan citizens who have joined their people's militia, who are under arms. So because you've abducted the president, yes, we can say, I'm sorry it happened. It's part of their model. You will see hundreds of videos of Chavez, and after him Maduro, being at mass demonstrations of the people, dancing amongst the people. They're not afraid of the people. They haven't even closed down the voice of the opposition. I would be far more draconian than they have been. I would have closed down the mass media of the opposition of the United States. This is a psychological operation against our revolution. Very simple. I would confiscate the means of production of the very wealthy class who still own some of them. I would renationalize the land. So I would take measures that they haven't taken. That's not to criticize them. Everything has its own historical process. It's their revolution, not my revolution. But it leaves a foothold for the US imperialists. It leaves a foothold for the wealthy to constantly plot against them. But the whole movement of direction is placing more and more power in the hands of the people, removing the influence of US imperialism and the local wealthy class over the system. And therefore, they've assembled this huge armada. They've started attacking fishing ships and small boats. They've started this worldwide propaganda against them. But they haven't really affected the structure of Venezuelan society. And the Venezuelan people are demanding the return of Maduro. Maduro, we've seen pictures of him, I'm fairly sure now, they're genuine pictures. Initially, I was like, is this a psyop? But no, they do seem to be genuine pictures of him being abducted. We've seen pictures of him quite calm, quite defiant. He's making little victory symbols while he's in handcuffs, saying, we will stay calm, stay strong. The Venezuelan government is in place. I'm not at all convinced that US imperialism has achieved its aims. Trump's announcing he has. But I think we have to be patient to see how it unfolds. But our comrades have certainly been recently to Venezuela. There's mass popular support of the concept that Venezuelan oil wealth, Venezuelan material wealth, the land, the resources, the factories should be used to develop the people. And that's not an idea that's going to be taken overnight. And the people themselves are armed to defend it. So we'll just have to see how it plays out. It's definitely an act of piracy. It's definitely an act of terrorism. It's definitely an illegal act. It definitely exposes US imperialism. It definitely fits in with their general policy, fits with what they're doing against Russia, against the Arab peoples, against the peoples of the world, it exposes them, but they have not won. I do not think that they've been victorious, and we shouldn't jump to that conclusion too quickly.
Dr. Ranjit Rath, thank you very much for that analysis. And with that, we're going to conclude this deep dive perspective. It's rolling news. You can't make definitive conclusions about what's going on in Venezuela at the moment, but certainly it has cataclysmic implications for the rest of the world. If the United States is allowed to violate international law so blatantly and so obviously, how does it affect the institutions of the world? What trust can we have in the likes of the United Nations or the wider infrastructure that the world has supposedly got in place to create a more peaceful world? Big questions to be asked about those institutions and their complicity and their eunuch status increasingly in terms of being able to affect what certainly the US imperialism is trying to impose around the world. Thank you for watching this deep dive perspective. Do like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And until the next program, goodbye.